Creative morning, everybody. So I want to start with a really fast and simple survey with a show of hands. How many people here live at home? How many people live at home? Show of hands. Show of hands. Come on. Do you live in the office? What? Do you live at home? Okay, I'm going to take that as a 100% yes response. And I'm also automatically going to assume that because you're in a talk called Creative Mornings, you must have an interest in creativity. Might be professional, might be personal, might be parental, might be all of the above. So you've all got a home, you've all got an interest in creativity. That's the good news. Now, maybe the not so good news, I can almost guarantee that everybody in this room is underutilizing their home as a creative asset. And by that I mean your home has probably not been designed to maximize the creative output of the people who live in it. And I'm not just talking about, how do I make more room for getting more stuff in, or what can I do for better lighting. I'm talking about something that's deeper than that, something that pervades the home everywhere you look. So how do I know this? I know this because there's a huge amount of information, tools, and products out there that people have been using to enhance the creativity of people in places like offices, retail spaces, and schools, but which nobody seems to have thought to apply to the domestic environment. So what is this information, and what are these tools, and what makes them revolutionary? Well, time being short today, I can only give you a little bit of a taste of them, but hopefully enough to inspire you to continue this inquiry by other means after this talk. So let's start with a quote by everybody's favorite architect, Winston Churchill. Okay, he wasn't an architect, but he did say something that's very key to this whole idea that I'm going to talk about, something about the relationship of us to the built environment, and it really underpins everything that's going to follow thereafter. So what did he say? He said, we shape our buildings, then our buildings shape us. All right, so let's parse this out a little bit. What does he mean by this? Well, take the first half, start at the beginning. We shape our buildings. I think that's fairly self-evident, of course. People shape buildings, architects, designers, planners, developers, builders, homeowners, all have a role. Built environment doesn't come about from Martians. So what about the second part? Then our buildings shape us. That maybe is a little less straightforward, a little less clear. How exactly do they shape us, and what about us are they shaping? Well, in past decades, a field has developed that starts to try to explain what I think was Churchill's intuitive observation. And that field is called environmental psychology. And as the name suggests, environmental psychology explores how physical conditions outside ourselves impact on how we act, how we think, and how we feel when we're in that environment. And by the way, I'll use environment in its fullest sense, meaning both the built and natural environment or the combination thereof. Now, one of the key mechanisms by which the external environment influences us is called brain priming. So brain priming takes place when some external stimulus, something you hear, something you see, smell, or touch, something coming through your senses triggers a response in you. There's two basic types of primes. One is direct, one is indirect. An example of a direct prime would be an advertisement, right? That's an explicit call to action, say, here, do this, buy this, go here, whatever. And there's also indirect primes, and those are the ones that are happening without your necessarily being aware of it. Now, one of the most best known and important examples of experimentation which revealed the presence of brain priming was done in 1984 by Roger Ulrich. He's a professor of architecture at Texas A&M. And what he did was, he went to the hospital, so to speak, and he set up two groups of patients. One group, and these are all surgery patients, they're in bed, they're in the hospital for X number of days. one group of patients is in a room with a view out the window to a brick wall. Some architects, some know-nothing architect, designed buildings so that when you look out the window, there's a nearby brick wall just because of the placement of the structures. And then the second group he looked at, same room, same surgery in there for X number of days, was looking out onto trees, some kind of landscape element outside their window. And what he found was, over a 6-month period of study, over numerous participants, is that the patients who were in the rooms with trees outside their windows required far less medication, had faster recoveries, had fewer negative incidents along their stay, just way more healthy than the people who looked at the brick wall. So what's going on here? We're correlating a prime. The prime is what you see out your window, the design factor, the view out the window, with the response, your physical, mental well-being. I mean, it doesn't get any more profound and intrinsic than that. So I want to take that same logic, connect a prime with creativity. That is, the prime is going to be a design factor, and the response is going to be a change in our behavior. That is our creative output, our creative performance. And in fact, I have a lot of evidence to draw from because someone went to the trouble of doing exactly that. In 2009, a couple of researchers from the University of British Columbia, they looked at the correlation of color, a design factor, of course, that is everywhere around us in the built environment, and creativity. And the way they did it was to set up two environments in two different colors, so to speak, to immerse participants in a blue environment and another group in a red environment. And then they gave everybody two types of tests. One is a test to measure creativity, certain problem-solving exercises, and so forth. And a second set of tests to measure analytic, rational thinking, not obviously, but the kind of opposite to creative thinking, which is about ideation and generating ideas and new ways of doing things. So what did these two researchers find? Again, very strong differentiation. The participants in the blue environment had a far higher rate of creative output. They were able to come up with more ideas, more solutions to problems than the people in the red environment. But kind of reverse happened as far as the analytic test. The people in the red environment scored much higher on their exercises than the people in the blue environment. So let me ask out there, does anybody have a guess as to why that would be the case? Why would the people in the blue room have a higher performance rate in creative exercises? Now, you're all designers of some kind, you're all creativists of some kind. What do we know about color? What's the difference between blues and reds in terms of temperature and their effects on the eye? Sorry, go ahead.
Well, you hear a lot about hospitals using fluid in those environments because it's more relaxing. So I imagine that what we would allow people to relax and thereby allow more space like this to filter. Right? And perhaps you put people on alert and they're thereby more focused in their task.
There is that. But my answer is a little different. I mean, what you're saying is absolutely true, and that's a whole set of ideas as well. But what I'm looking for here is a correlation between color and space. What do we know about cool colors? Cool colors recede in depth, right? I mean, and red colors are warm. It's warm, and they advance toward you. This is just the way we're wired. If you have two rooms and one's painted all blue, one's painted all red, they're otherwise identical, put people in them and you ask them which one is bigger, they'll all say the blue room is bigger, purely for optical effect. Well, I think that is what really gets at the heart of this particular experiment. Because in a lot of ways, what we have here is a kind of spatial corollary between the perception of space, the depth of space that is expanding, enlarging, growing around you, and the perception of space that is kind of converging, coming towards you. And in fact, this is a great way to talk about a model for creative thinking called the divergent convergent model. It was developed by a psychologist named J.P. Guilford starting in the 50s. And this sort of is one of several ways people have tried to explain what is creative thinking all about. And what Guilford says is basically it's a process, of course. It doesn't just happen in an instant. And if you kind of read left to right the diagram here, you start with a statement of a problem of some sort. and you're kind of at the narrow end of that triangle, that funnel. And the first thing you want to do is just start expanding on possibilities, right? Ideation, generating as many thoughts, possibilities as possible. You're throwing the net wide open. You're trying to take in as much as possible. You're ruling very few things out. You want to be open-minded. And then at a certain point, there's a kind of inflection, right? Because at some point, you got to just stop gathering things in, and you need to start focusing in. You need to start converging. That is, starting to get rid of certain factors, certain possibilities, until you converge on a solution, an answer. And in a way, that's a perfect diagram for what's happening in space. The blue room is diverging, getting wider, getting larger, whereas the red room is converging, getting narrower, focusing in on a particular solution. And that's exactly what happened in the experiment. So, if we can talk about a corollary between space and expansiveness and open to new ideas, openness in terms of lateral dimensions, right? The walls are painted blue, the walls are painted red. What about the third dimension, vertical dimension, height? Shouldn't that have the same effect if we can manipulate our environment to increase the vertical dimension in the space that we're working? And just so happens, exactly the same two researchers had the very same question in mind, and they ran another experiment, actually a couple of years before the color one, in which they put people in two rooms, really one room, first with an 8-foot ceiling, which was a drop ceiling, so it was kind of a false ceiling, and then again another group in a ceiling that went up to 10 feet by removing the drop ceiling. Everything else is exactly the same. Again, what did we find? Far greater performance in terms of creativity exercises in the tall room versus the short room, better on convergent, rational, analytic, linear thinking, whatever you want to call it, in the lower ceiling room. And somebody else gave it this catchy name. It's called the cathedral effect. Actually, it was William Lidwell in his book, The Universal Principles of Design, or Principles of Universal Design, one of those books, Lidwell, gave it the name the cathedral effect, and I think what he was alluding to here, of course, are the great Gothic cathedrals with their enormous emphasis on the vertical dimension. If you walk into those buildings in Europe or in America, there is this very strong vertical dimension. It also happens to be the name of a particular type of ceiling called the cathedral ceiling, which is what you see here. It's two planes converging in the middle. From opposite walls. I think it's more of a double entendre than an actual illusion between this type of ceiling and the Gothic cathedrals, but you get the same idea. And the fact is, you don't need to have a room with just a tall, flat ceiling. Ceilings come in many different dimensions and configurations. There's a whole lexicon of different ceiling types: vaulted ceilings, tray ceilings, cove ceilings, barrel vaults, all sorts of ways that you can shape space, give it character, but really emphasize that vertical dimension. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, this is all very good, but I live in a house or an apartment. I can't just blow away the floor of the apartment above me and suddenly create double height spaces. Well, do not worry. There are all sorts of techniques you can use to manipulate the space that exists to create the optical effect. Remember, this isn't just about the literal dimension, but what your eye is perceiving. For example, you can use wall coverings with vertical stripes on them, because that helps to kind of lead the eye upward. Anything you can do to kind of emphasize the upward direction visually will enhance the perception of height. Or say something like this, where the top of the wall flares out in a concave curve called a cove. And here, anything you can do that kind of softens the transition, the hard transition between the vertical wall and the horizontal ceiling by merging them in this kind of continuing sweep, which they then, whoever designed the room, cleverly used paint color to do as well, right? They continue the paint color up into the horizontal ceiling. All of these are various techniques and things you can do to enhance the height of the space that you have. Now, time is short here, so we can only touch on these particular design factors, but there are many others where there has been strong research into direct correlations between design and creativity. Some of those factors: light, sound and music, temperature, even the shape of your furnishings, artwork, pets, and landscaping, greenery. These are just some of the subjects that we could talk about in the same way. So let's shift our perspective a little bit from these design factors that are fairly pervasive, right? You find them almost anywhere in a home, almost any space. And let's look at a kind of room-by-room analysis of design and creativity. And obviously, homes have many different types of spaces. Some are very strongly associated with creativity, home offices, studios, even garages, as we know. Other spaces a little less so, though there are, I think, hidden capabilities in many of these spaces that can be brought out in research. So with our limited time, I've chosen to highlight just one space in particular that in many ways is not only the place where we perform some of our most consistent and intensive creative activities in a typical home, but in a lot of ways I think embodies many of the key concepts in how we understand creativity today, which makes it a great teaching tool as much as an object of design. And that room, of course, is the kitchen, and the activity that goes on in it, of course, is cooking and to some degree eating a close second. So what can the kitchen and its activity of cooking and eating tell us about creativity? Well, how about the fact that creativity is often described as something which comes about through a combinatorial process. That is, we create new things by taking existing things and jamming them together in a big mashup. And the classic example that's given whenever this point is brought out is Gutenberg's printing press, which, as many of you have perhaps learned, was a mashup of a wine press, right? A machine that would crush grapes with movable type, as well as some developments in ink and paper production and so forth. So he takes something and turns it into something completely different by mashing things together and putting them to new uses, and merely, revolutionizes the world of information and culture forever after. Something a little closer to home, something near and dear to all of us. Smartphone, of course, is a huge mashup. Just think of all the functions, flashlights, alarm clocks, compasses, all of these things that used to stand alone that are now converged on a single product. And Mr. Jobs, of course, knew this fact very well, that in saying creativity is just connecting things. I mean, he makes it sound so easy, but that really does get at the core of the issue. And there's the idea that you can mash up things together and remix them and create new from old is not limited just to physical products, ideas, concepts, formulas such as E equals MC squared. All three factors here totally known before Einstein, but he arranged them in such a way as to create something totally new. And again, he understood what the process was about when he wrote in 1942, combinatory play seems to be the essential feature in productive thought. So what is cooking? I mean, in a lot of ways, it is a combinatorial activity. You take disparate ingredients, you combine them in sometimes new ways to create your end product. That's another thing we can analogize between kitchen, cooking, eating, and creativity. Well, they're both collaborative and social activities. Kitchen, a particularly good place to bring people together, to render them in a kind of social environment. And this, I think, certainly gives the lie to the idea of the lone creator, right? The myth that somehow invention and innovation all come from single individuals. In fact, historically, that is almost never the case. We talk about Steve Jobs, but really, where would he be without Wozniak? Where would he be without the folks at Xerox PARC, a laboratory run by that company from which he stole a lot of his information to build the first Macs? Where would he be without the tens of thousands of people that work for the company, that work for Apple? He would not be Steve Jobs without all of these other people. Cooking, eating, creativity are activities that involve play, that are generally fun, certainly in their outcome. Albert Einstein, creativity is the imagination having fun. But sometimes things go wrong. You burn the turkey. There's 30 relatives in the living room waiting for you on Thanksgiving Day. Okay, this is part of creativity too. I'm sure we've all experienced setbacks, maybe even failures, but the idea is that you have to try again. That is the way things happen in innovation. And sometimes, as you're trying things, you think you're out to solve one problem, but you end up solving something entirely different. And there are innumerable stories about great inventions, innovations that come about entirely by accident. My favorite is the popsicle. It was actually an 11-year-old boy in Chicago, turn of the century, who was trying to mix up some newfangled dessert, some gooey mix that he was hoping he could create. And one night, after days of work trying to create his dessert, he left out a bucket of his gooey mix out on his front porch. This was before refrigeration. And he left a stirring stick in it just by chance. And that night, temperatures plunged in Chicago and froze the gooey mix in his little pail, in his little bucket, and the popsicle was born. Time and again, things come about without your setting out to do so. But here's the thing, you have to be involved trying to set out to solve a problem in order to stumble on a solution. So Louis Pasteur says chance comes to the prepared mind. He means you got to be in the game, you got to be working at it in order to have these kind of happy accidents happen. And last, we've all heard the expression, you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. Creativity, just like that, is by its nature destructive as much as it's constructive. Something called creative destruction is a concept coined some years ago, where each new innovation, each new creative effort has the potential of either destroying it altogether or certainly changing the status of current ways of doing things and thinking about things. So, again, time limited. This is just one example of the sort of things that you can start to think about in terms of the different spaces in your home, other spaces, bedroom, bath, children's room, library, home office, exercise room, garages, all sorts of interesting ways that these rooms both reveal and can nurture creativity in ways that perhaps we're not all thinking about or aware of. So the last part of the talk is about the things in your home. We've talked about spaces, we've talked about generalized design factor. What about the objects, the belongings that populate your home? In a lot of ways, a house is not a home if it's empty, but how can we utilize the fact that we have belongings to boost, jumpstart our creativity? Well, obviously, the whole effort of furnishing, decorating a home is itself a creative act, but in a way, it's kind of a one-shot deal, right? I mean, you kind of move into a space, you develop it according to your aesthetic vision, your practical needs, and then you're kind of done. I mean, every now and then you might make some incremental changes, you might renovate every few years, but how do we make something more perpetual in helping us be better creative individuals? Well, there's a whole class of products, of things, that I've kind of gathered together, which I would suggest is kind of the answer to this question. And what you would do is take your, what I call conventional products, and replace them with what I'm calling creative-based design, or what others have called co-creative design, for lack of better terms. And there are 6 principles which define this class of products that I'll just run through here before finishing up. So if you can find products that qualify, you check off each of these boxes, you know you have a co-creative, creativity-based design product. Starting with, these products are all flexible, they're changeable in some way. So on your left is your conventional knapsack. It's a monolith, it's static, right? I mean, you can open up the zippers, you put your stuff in, you take it out, you're done. The knapsack on the right, however, is designed a little differently because, in fact, it has been, in a sense, exploded into multiple parts. It's been decombined, almost reverse combinatorial creativity, by breaking it up into small parts, which you can then recombine together in ways however you need to suit your purposes at the moment. So today, you just need to bring your laptop. You don't need this whole empty knapsack with mostly air inside. Second principle of design is that these are all interactive products. On the left, our conventional candlestick. You take it, you put it on the table, you put it back on the shelf, you're done. But on the right, we have that same breakdown, modularizing of what was previously a monolithic product into 9 different parts, little glass pieces which all align on the center stem, which you can then take out, put back in different combinations to create different profiles as you see on the right. And mathematically, you have 362,880 possibilities for arranging those pieces, which, for all intents and purposes, means it's infinite in opportunity. Third principle, these things are all tactile, right? Touched. You have to somehow engage them, interact them through the medium of the hand. On the left, conventional alarm clock. You hit the snooze button. That's about the extent of it. On the right, a clock that's been turned into a series of connected but disparate cubes, which you could then play around with to form different combinations. Principle 4, open design. These are open-ended designs, or in effect, open-ended designs. There is no single solution to the problem. Left, static, there it is, piece of furniture, done. On the right, storage unit that's made up of a series of boxes or compartments that you can put together and clamp together however you need. Which, by the way, this is not just about play and fun and kind of exercising imagination, but really solves problems. So you have maybe a space in your home which doesn't fit any standard dimension bookcase, but you can certainly tailor a product like this to fit your immediate context, and then when you move, instead of having to throw out that bookcase, that fixed bookcase, you can simply pull this apart and arrange it to suit the new context. So these are problem solvers as much as they are objects of aesthetic play. Fifth, there's an act of selectivity, right? You're choosing which parts to put together. You're making choices, divergent into convergent. So on the left, a t-shirt with an imprint of a monster head, but on the right, a box of triangular cut cardboard pieces, each of which has a piece of the monster head printed on it, which you can then take and recombine to make even more fantastic head figures, selecting which pieces that you want. And last, all of these products are systems-based, meaning there is some rhyme or reason to how things come together. A pile of sand is not system-based, but all the other products have their mechanisms for manipulation in the ways that we've talked about. So once you start kind of looking for these types of co-creative products, and by the way, co-creative meaning the relationship of the user and designer has changed from the conventional passive, right, the consumer taking the product and simply having it, so to speak, to one where both the designer and the user are co-creating, right, continually making different solutions to the problems. Less of a top-down vertical hierarchy, more democratic, more horizontal, more consistent with our culture of today. But anyway, you can find these kind of products in almost every aspect of the home, from lighting, toys, accessories, jewelry and apparel, storage, shelving. I mean, there's just thousands of them. And I have gone to the trouble of pulling together my favorite 300 to put in that wonderful book that that person has so rightfully earned. And there you have it. Thank you very much.
We have some time, so if you don't have to run off to your day job, we'd love for you to hang out and do some Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand. Don't be shy. We like to get weird here. Don will answer them. If they're better for after, I'll tell you to hold off until after the thing. Cool? Sweet!
Sir.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was unbelievable. So the sixth concept I didn't fully understand, systems-based. Could you just explain that a little bit?
Well, the systems, you know, it sounds there's a rationale for how things work, whereas, you know, think of grains of sand, they're merely adjacent to each other. There's no means by which they come together. There's no means to know, is this the right pile or the right pile, but is this a valid pile or not a valid pile? You know, there's a whole world out there about systems, but if you think of something that's more randomized versus something that has an outcome you can generate through conscious effort, there's a system involved. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could just briefly touch on a few of the factors that you sort of went, it was a bulleted list, but specifically light, sound, and music, and temperature, because those are all things that we could go home today, maybe, in effect.
Sure.
So I'm sort of curious if you could just...
Well, light's interesting, only because it's kind of the third leg of the first two that I happen to show, the spatial corollaries. And what research has found that generally in the ideation phase, the divergent phase, more dimly lighted interiors tend to boost creativity versus a brightly lighted space, which is actually better for the convergent phase. So why would that be the case? I have a great photograph of Steve Jobs sitting in his house in 1982 where he's in this dimly lit room, absolutely no furniture except for a stereo system in the background, and it's got one lamp that's lighting the whole room. The walls and the ceilings are kind of murky, right? So you don't have that, you can't gauge the depth as clearly in a dim environment as you can in a bright one. So the sense of space is just kind of leaking outwards, ties in with color and height. Sound, you know, they have done studies that show that your ideal decibel level, I know it starts to sound kind of funny at times, is 70 decibels for maximum creativity. Any louder and it starts to impact on your thinking, any quieter, and you kind of think, well, quiet, that must be the best. No, 70 decibels is roughly equivalent to when you go into Starbucks on a medium busy day. And I think that's one of the reasons why people do that, because that background chatter, I think what it does is it takes the edge off your thinking a little bit. So that focused thinking, that convergent thinking, you kind of want to get away from in the initial idea generation brainstorming. So that kind of makes sense. Temperature, you asked about temperature? 77 degrees. You know, it gets, 77 degrees. So they did this study of an office in Tampa, Florida, for some reason, I don't know. And they found 77 degrees, people make the fewest mistakes in their work. Okay, so this makes some sense. What's happening when you start cooling things down? The blood gets out of your head and starts going into other parts of your body to keep you warm. So you're kind of draining some very necessary fluids from where you need the most, your mind. So there's reasons for all of this once you get past these kind of, dry statistics. Music also is interesting, I mean, partly for the similar reasons as sound, but also they found that playing music, not just listening, not just the passive experience, playing music is a great way to kind of unlock the brain. And Einstein, is the famous example when he was hitting a roadblock in his calculations, he'd whip out his violin and start playing, and then it was like, oh yeah, right, okay, put it down. And I think distraction, you gotta leave the problem sometimes to find a solution to it. If you're too, like I'm beating at it and it's not working, you have to step away. Music is a great way to just let your brain work in the background. There's all sorts of neurological reasons why and how it does that. Sherlock Holmes is another great violin player. If you see the movies, he also is playing the violin when he's got to solve a problem.
What's the one thing that you've walked into a place and said that is absolutely killing creativity? One thing that sticks out in your mind.
I hate acoustic ceilings. Yeah, something about those that just dry me out. I mean, it just feels like so commercial. I don't know what the word is, so I can say acoustic ceilings. Anybody else?
What's an acoustic ceiling?
Oh, what's an acoustic ceiling? Well, it's not here. When you go into is there one out there? It's those rectangles, panels that are up in the ceiling. You see the grid, and the panels have these little perforations. They are meant to absorb sound. That's actually dropped down from the actual ceiling, this exposed ceiling, so it doesn't have to drop ceiling. But that's what I mean, that particular rendition of the acoustic or drop ceiling.
Any more? All right, let's do one more round of applause.